I made that up. This story, this beautiful story, this powerful story, which has two terrific lines from Jesus in it, this story was not originally in the Gospel of John. This is a story that was added to the Gospel of John by later scribes. How do I know that? We have a number of early manuscripts of the Gospel of John. This story is not found in any of our early or best manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The Greek authors who wrote commentaries on the Gospel of John over the centuries don't mention this story until the 10th century, 1,000 years after the days of Jesus. The writing style of this story, if you read it in Greek, the writing style is a completely different writing style from the writing style of the rest of the Gospel of John. As a result, scholars have known for years that this story did not originally belong in the Gospel of John. Well, why is it in our English Bibles then? Probably what happened was some scribe had heard the story. They'd heard the story and they decided that it illustrated some of the teachings in John chapter 7, and so they wrote out the story in a margin. A second scribe came along, saw the story in the margin, and thought it belonged in the text, and then wrote his manuscript by putting the story in the text. Another scribe comes along and copies that manuscript, and that manuscript gets copied, and so on until it becomes part of the textual tradition. And it's these later manuscripts that were used by the translators of the King James Bible in 1611 so that the story came into English through the King James Bible. So this story, however, is not a story that was originally in the New Testament. So people sometimes ask me, well, are there any changes that are significant in the New Testament? Yeah, well, this strikes me as a rather significant change, that the story of the woman taken in adultery wasn't originally there. Or consider a second instance of another big difference, the Gospel of Mark. Mark is probably my favorite gospel because it's so subtle and understated in places, and it says things that you don't expect. And nowhere is this more true than in the ending of Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is put on trial, and he's crucified, he's dead, he's buried, and on the third day, the women go to the tomb. The tomb is empty, and Jesus is not in it. There's some man in there, and the man tells the women that Jesus is not here, he's been raised from the dead. He tells the women, go tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And then it says the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. That's where it ends. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. And you think, how could it end there? They're told to tell the disciples, but they don't tell anybody. Didn't the disciples ever learn? Didn't they go to Galilee? Didn't they see Jesus? How could that be the end of the story? And that's exactly the reaction the scribes had. They got to that ending, they said, how could it end there? And scribes then decided it couldn't add there, and so they added 12 verses. So that in your English Bibles today, you'll find 12 more verses after that, after chapter 16, verse 8. And often they'll be in double brackets, because the translators will tell you in a footnote, these verses weren't originally in here, these were added by later scribes. In these verses, in these added verses the scribes added later, but we know they're added later because they're not in the earliest and best manuscripts. The writing style is different from the rest of the Gospel of Mark, and in fact there are inconsistencies between this ending and the verses that precede it. So this is clearly an addition to the Gospel of Mark. In these final verses, according to these final verses, the women do go tell the disciples do go to Galilee, they do meet Jesus there, and Jesus then tells them that they're to make the disciples of all the nations, and people become his disciples will be able to speak in foreign languages that they previously didn't know. They'll be able to handle deadly snakes, and they'll be able to drink poison and it won't harm them. These are the verses that the Appalachian snake handlers in my part of the world use to base their liturgical practices on. I've always thought that sometime in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, somebody should point out, actually those verses aren't in the Gospel of Mark. Mark actually ends with the women not saying anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Somebody added the last 12. Let me give you a couple more examples of some differences that strike me as big. One that I think is really quite interesting that scholars debate. The first two I gave you, scholars don't debate very much. Almost everybody agrees that they weren't originally there. But there's an interesting change in another story in Mark that there's a lot of debate about among scholars. It's a story in Mark chapter 1 where Jesus heals a leper. And the way the story works is that Jesus is walking along, and a leper comes up to him, and the leper says to him, this is a guy with leprosy, and he comes up to him and he says, Lord, if you're willing, you're able to cleanse me. And in most manuscripts it says that Jesus felt compassion for the man, and he reached out his hand and he said, I am willing, and he healed him. But in several ancient manuscripts it says something different. In these other manuscripts, instead of saying Jesus felt compassion for the man, it says, and Jesus got angry and reached out his hand and said, I am willing, be cleansed. Getting angry. Now, scholars have to debate which is the text that Mark originally wrote and which is the text that's been changed by a scribe. And one piece of logic that scholars have used over the years is this. Ask yourself, which text is a scribe more likely to have created out of the other? Is a scribe likely to have taken the text that says Jesus felt compassion and changed it to say Jesus got angry? Or is a scribe likely to have found the text that said Jesus got angry and to change it to say Jesus felt compassion? Well, if you put it like that, then, the latter is more likely something a scribe would have changed. And so this criterion ends up sounding kind of backwards, but the way the criterion works is that the reading that's the most difficult to understand is probably the original one. Okay? The more difficult reading is to be preferred. And so that's one reason for thinking that, in fact, this text originally said Jesus got angry. And there are actually a whole host of reasons for thinking that's what the text said. The next step, then, is to ask, well, what's he angry about? In other words, to try and figure out what the text means. But you can't know what the text means unless you know what the text says. You see? So you've got to establish the words first, and that's what people who are textual critics do. They try and decide what the words originally were. Let me give you one other example, and then I'm going to stop and take any questions that you have. There's another quite moving passage in the Gospel of Luke. Which is also well known. It's a scene in which Jesus is being crucified, and Luke is interesting in the scene of Jesus' crucifixion. Luke is interesting at the scene of the crucifixion because it's unlike what happens in Luke is unlike what happens in Mark's gospel, the story of the crucifixion. In Mark's, just to illustrate this for a second, in Mark's gospel, which is the first gospel, you have a very distinct portrayal of Jesus going to his crucifixion, a portrayal that is filled with pathos and agony. People don't realize this, that Mark's portrayal is very different from Luke's portrayal. And the reason they don't see that there are differences is because of the way that people read the Gospels. The way people typically read the Gospels, if they read the Gospels at all, but if they read the Gospels, the normal way of reading a Gospel is you start at the beginning and you read to the end. So, okay, you're going to read the Gospel. You start with Matthew. You start with the first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, and you start reading and you get to the end. You go from top to bottom. Then you read Mark. Start with the beginning, go to the end, top to bottom, and it sounds a lot like Matthew. Same stories, a lot of the same words, sounds very similar. Then you read Luke, top to bottom, sounds exactly the same. Not exactly, it's different, but it's basically the same thing. They sound alike. And then you read John, well, that's different, but, in essence, it's not that far off. So they all sound basically the same because you read them from top to bottom, or you read them vertically. The way to see differences in the Gospels is to read them not vertically, but to read them horizontally. Where you read a story in Matthew and you look at the same story in Mark and compare the two stories. When you do that, you start finding enormous differences. There are all these debates about whether there are discrepancies in the Bible. But if you want to find discrepancies in the Bible, all you have to do is read the texts horizontally. I give this as an assignment to my students all the time. I give them I say, take the resurrection accounts. What really happened at the resurrection? Depends which author you read. And so I have them list what happens in Matthew, what happens in Mark, what happens in Luke, what happens in John, and compare the list. And it's actually quite striking when you do this with the resurrection narratives. Because, well, who is it that goes to the tomb? Is it Mary Magdalene by herself or Mary with other women? If other women, how many other women? And what are their names? It depends which gospel you read. What do they find there? Is the stone rolled away already or is it not rolled away already? Depends which gospel you read. Who do they see there? Do they see a man there as in Mark? Do they see two men there as in Luke? Or do they see an angel as in Matthew? Depends which gospel you read. What are they told? Are they told to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, or are they told to tell the disciples to stay in Jerusalem? Do they go tell the disciples? It depends whether you read Mark or whether you read Matthew and Luke. If they do tell the disciples, what do the disciples do? Do they go to Galilee, or do they stay in Jerusalem? It depends which gospel you read. I mean, you just go down the line, and it's different. And that's what you get if you read these stories against each other. Well, if you do that in the story of the crucifixion in Mark and Luke, you come up with very, very different portrayals. The significance of that is not just, okay, it's as though there are discrepancies. Yeah, there are discrepancies, but that isn't the point. The point is that if you want to know what Mark has to say, you have to read Mark.